When you really stop and look at the landscape of modern medicine, the sheer pace of innovation is absolutely staggering. But for the longest time, the regulatory processes that are actually designed to keep us safe, well, they just couldn't keep up with that pace. So today, we're diving into a really pivotal concept that literally revolutionized regulatory science. We're talking about the surrogate endpoint and how this brilliant idea of using predictive proxies actually accelerates approvals across the entire medical spectrum.
Here is our agenda for today. 1. The approval bottleneck. 2. Meet the surrogate endpoint. 3. The catch. Trust but verify. 4. Generics and biosimilars. 5. Clearing medical devices. And finally, 6. Funding the fast track. Let's get into it.
So how exactly do you approve a life-saving drug when patients just don't have years to wait? I mean, this is the ultimate high-stakes question regulators face when they're dealing with serious, life-threatening conditions. Imagine, just for a second, a scenario where researchers have developed this promising new treatment for severe disease. The early data, it looks fantastic, but the standard requirement to absolutely prove that this drug extends a patient's lifespan takes years and years of observation. For patients facing terminal illnesses, those are years they simply do not have.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the approval bottleneck. To really understand this, we have to go back in time a bit. Back in 1938, the FDA was mostly focused on just making sure a drug was safe before it hit the market. Simple enough, right? But in 1962, everything changed. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment came along, and it was a total revolution in FDA authority. It added this massive new hurdle. Manufacturers now had to demonstrate substantial evidence of a drug's efficacy. Basically, you couldn't just prove it was safe anymore, you had to prove it actually worked. This was the birth of the modern FDA approval process. But while it definitely ensured we got highly effective medications, it inadvertently created massive delays for critically ill patients.
The tension here was just undeniable. On one hand, science was rocketing forward. On the other, the bureaucratic proof took way too long for patients who were literally running out of time. The FDA faced immense criticism for these delays, so they started looking for ways to expedite approvals for life-threatening diseases, coming up with things like the treatment IND rule for expanded access. But the real game changer? That came when the Accelerated Approval rules were formally codified in 1992.
Which brings us to Section 2, Meet the surrogate endpoint.
So what is this exactly? Well, instead of waiting years to measure a definitive clinical benefit, like how long a patient lives or if the disease is completely cured, we use a predictive proxy right now. The FDA calls this a surrogate endpoint. It could be something like a shrinking tumor on an MRI or a specific change in a lab test, kind of like measuring lower blood pressure to predict a reduced risk of a heart attack. The absolute key phrase to remember here is thought to predict. It isn't the final clinical benefit itself, but a highly reliable indicator that the clinical benefit is on its way.
And this is absolutely crucial, because waiting for absolute proof of a clinical benefit, that can take half a decade of grueling multi-phase trials. But measuring a surrogate endpoint, that can shave literal years off the development clock. By letting drug companies fill an unmet medical need based on these surrogate endpoints, the FDA gets vital, potentially life-saving treatments into the hands of patients dramatically faster.
Moving on to Section 3, the catch. Trust but verify. Now, speed requires guardrails. The FDA carefully tracks accelerated approvals across a few major categories, and they're specifically targeting serious conditions that fill an urgent, unmet medical need. We see heavy use of this pathway in cancer treatments, infectious diseases, and severe neurological disorders. These are life-or-death areas where the risk of waiting for a traditional approval far outweighs the risk of relying on a surrogate endpoint.
But here is the catch, the trust but verify part. Getting accelerated approval based on a surrogate endpoint is definitely not the end of the road. Drug companies are legally required to conduct post-marketing studies to confirm that anticipated clinical benefit. If the confirmatory trial succeeds, awesome, the FDA grants traditional approval. But if that proxy fails to actually predict real-world success, the regulatory guardrails kick in hard, and the FDA has strict procedures in place to pull the product from the market entirely.
Let's look at Section 4, Generics and Biosimilars.
The philosophy of using predictive markers isn't just for brand new drugs. Enacted in 2010 as part of the Affordable Care Act, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, or BPCIA, was actually modeled on earlier generic drug acts. It created an abbreviated pathway for biologics. You know those really complex medicines usually produced in living cells? This completely mirrors the proxy logic we just talked about. Instead of forcing a competitor to run years of brand new clinical trials just to prove their version of an existing biologic works, the BPCIA lets them submit an abbreviated application.
So, bioequivalence and high similarity basically act as spiritual cousins to the surrogate endpoint. For your traditional chemical generic drugs, the Hatch-Waxman Act prevents the FDA from demanding entirely new safety and efficacy data. The generic company just has to prove bioequivalence, meaning the drug acts the exact same way in a human body as the innovator drug. For biosimilars under the BPCIA, the standard is proving there are no clinically meaningful differences in safety, purity, and potency from the reference product. It's all about relying on comparative data as a proxy for de novo clinical trials. And the optimization doesn't stop at the initial approval either. Modern manufacturing frameworks, like established conditions, can facilitate up to a 40% reduction in paperwork submissions for older producers. 40%! By explicitly defining which manufacturing components are truly critical for product quality, manufacturers only need official FDA approval for modifications to those specific conditions. Everything else is managed internally by the company's own quality system, which incredibly accelerates the regulatory machine without compromising safety one bit.
Next up, Section 5, Clearing Medical Devices.
This concept of abbreviated evidence, it applies to medical tech too. Just like generics avoid new trials by proving bioequivalence, medical devices can totally skip the highly stringent, super expensive pre-market approval process if they can prove they're substantially equivalent to a predicate device. And this is fascinating. That usually means an older device that was already on the market prior to May 28, 1976. So, if a new piece of technology has a similar design, material, and intended use as that historical predicate, it can leapfrog the standard timeline and go straight through the much faster 510(k) pathway.
Now, I want to highlight a really precise and vital distinction in regulatory language here. Because the 510(k) pathway relies on substantial equivalence rather than brand new trials, the FDA technically considers these devices cleared rather than approved. It's a subtle legal distinction for sure, but the end result for patients and doctors is exactly the same. Much faster access to critical medical technology on the market.
Finally, Section 6, Funding the Fast Track.
Of course, all of these expedited pathways require immense regulatory resources to actually execute smoothly. User fees paid by the pharmaceutical industry itself ensure this massive engine stays funded. First enacted in 1992, which not coincidentally is the exact same year accelerated approval rules were codified, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, allows the FDA to commit to strict review timelines. By collecting these fees, the FDA can hire the scientists, doctors, and specialists required to safely evaluate all this complex surrogate endpoint data without keeping patients waiting.
And thanks to PDUFA, the FDA aims for highly predictable targets. A standard new drug application has a goal of 10 months, priority applications drop to just 6 months, and summary submissions are targeted for a remarkable 2-month review cycle. These predictable timeframes completely revolutionize drug development. They allow companies to plan confidently and ultimately get therapies to the clinic so much faster.
Which brings us to our final, really crucial thought for today. We've seen how surrogate endpoints, bioequivalence, and substantial equivalence act as powerful proxies, completely dismantling the historical bottlenecks that kept vital treatments away from desperate patients. But it remains a really delicate dance. As our scientific tools for predicting long-term outcomes get sharper and sharper, regulators are going to be constantly tasked with balancing the urgent need for speed with the uncompromising demand for safety. It's a fascinating evolution of medical science for sure, and one that continues to reshape the future of healthcare as we know it.